Thank you for the introduction. I didn't understand anything, but I assume it was a kind introduction. So hello, everyone. I will be presenting today an empirical study of sorts that is part of my ongoing PhD research. The study is about copyright and technology, and as you all know, technology may influence copyright law in a number of different ways. It may enable new types of works, new forms of authorship, new ways of using works, new ways of enforcing rights. I will be focusing only on technology-enabled uses, so new ways of using works. This includes things as diverse as photocopying, TV broadcasting, hyperlinking, streaming, what have you. And from a doctrinal point of view, the font was a bit different, but it doesn't matter. From a doctrinal point of view, I was saying, technology-enabled uses raise questions about the scope of rights and about the exceptions to those rights. And limitations to the scope of rights and exceptions are very important in the design, in the overall design of copyright. They are the holes in the system through which we balance different interests, the interests of authors and the interests of users. And as Professor James Boyle once wrote, the holes matter as much as the cheese. So they are very important, basically. And in Europe, this debate about technology-enabled uses has been cast as a controversy, as an opposition between two ways of establishing exceptions. On the one hand, we have fair use, and on the other, we have a closed list of exceptions. And there is a conventional view about this opposition. I'm sure you're familiar, or relatively familiar with this conventional view, according to which while a standard like fair use gives courts greater flexibility or greater discretion, you can call it that way too, a closed list of exceptions gives all the stakeholders greater predictability. So this is the conventional view. The narrative goes more or less like this. Under the US fair use doctrine, for courts to render an unauthorized use non-infringing, they have to engage in a balancing exercise. They have to balance different factors like the purpose of the use, the degree of market harm inflicted by the use, and this balancing exercise gives them greater flexibility. On the other hand, under the closed list system, which is typical of the droit d'auteur system, of the French system, and it was adopted in the Information Society Directive, Article 5, you only have a limited number of exceptions, and you need to conduct a subsumption reasoning and subsume uses under those exceptions. And besides the closed character of the list, there are a number of other interpretative constraints. Rights must be broadly interpreted, exceptions must be strictly interpreted, and we also have this three-step test, which acts as a further limit on the judicial application of exceptions. This system is very restrictive, but it has the advantage of providing greater predictability, or at least so the conventional view says. But at the same time, it has been characterized as a statutory straitjacket because it prevents European courts from accommodating technological innovation, from accommodating new technology-enabled uses of copyrighted works. Now, I think that this conventional view leads us into a paradox. And why does it lead us into a paradox? If we look at European court decisions, we quickly understand that some courts have been deciding some of these cases on technology-enabled uses in a pragmatic, in a creative fashion. And I'll give you two examples. The first example is relatively well known. It comes from Germany. It's the Vorschaubilder 1 case, a case on thumbnails, on the thumbnails shown by the Google result list. Basically, in that case, no exception applied to showing thumbnails by Google. So the Bundesgerichtshof resorted to the doctrine of implicit consent to declare that the use was non-infringing. The second case comes from Germany. The Spanish Supreme Court in the Megakini versus Google Spain case, which was a case on search engine caching, basically construed the three-step test as a special manifestation in the Spanish intellectual property law of the doctrines of good faith and abuse of rights. And it also said, quite surprisingly, that the fact that the system in Europe is very restrictive should not lead us to absurd conclusions. So no absurd conclusions under this system. So these are two good examples of judicial creativity in the European system. So now you see the paradox, right? we live under a system that allegedly gives us greater predictability, but there's no predictability whatsoever because the courts are deciding some of these cases in a very pragmatic fashion. So what I decided to do was, I decided to empirically investigate whether there is any predictability, any reasonable regularity in the outcomes of these cases. And I looked at CJEU decisions. I have so far 15 decisions. There are 4 or 5 cases pending, but the sample ranges from InfoPack in 2009 up to the recent judgment in the GS Media case last month. So the first question I asked was, are the interpretative constraints, is the restrictive system in the EU preventing the court from rendering technology-enabled uses non-infringing? So I looked at the outcome of these cases and I realized that the answer seems to be no. Of course, this is only descriptive statistics, but in 10 out of 15 cases, the court rendered the use non-infringing. Again, the study has its limitations, but it's still striking that 67% of the cases have been decided in a non-infringing way. Then, as other researchers before had done, I decided to look at the arguments used by the court to justify these outcomes. And there are basically 4 arguments: the high level of protection of authors, technological development, high level of protection of authors, fair balance, technological development, and legal certainty. And this makes the picture even more confusing because the 2 arguments that are used more frequently, high level of protection, and here should be written fair balance, are used both in infringing and non-infringing cases, despite the fact that they point in opposite directions. So it makes no sense. So then I asked the question, let's look at the reasoning of the court, at the actual reasoning of the court, and see if it is deciding in a pragmatic or in a formalist manner. Is it abiding by the interpretative constraints or not? So I coded the decisions as either pragmatic or formalist, and they would be coded as pragmatic if the court engaged in a narrow interpretation of the rights, which it cannot do, in a broad interpretation of the exceptions, which allegedly it cannot do either, or if it distinguished the case from previous applicable precedents. And I came to the conclusion that in 13 out of 15 cases, the court employs at least one of these elements of pragmatism. Only in InfoPack and ACI Adam did the court engage in a purely formalist reasoning. So we're left with the same problem, right? Where is predictability? And I thought that if formal legal reasoning and copyright doctrine are not explaining the outcome, something else must be. So I looked for patterns in the decisions of the court. And while I was doing a preliminary reading of the decisions, I noted some similarities between cases in the EU and well-known fair use cases in the United States. So I decided to code the decisions according to the traditional fair use factors and the typically relevant factors in technology cases. And while some of the factors were completely irrelevant, I came to the conclusion that there was one noticeable difference with respect to one factor. That factor is market harm. So basically, in all the infringing and all the mixed cases, there was some market harm involved. Only in 20% of the non-infringing cases there was such market harm. There were 2 cases, SAS Institute, in which there was an economic loss, but for legitimate competitive reasons, and in the Ulmer case, in which the derivative market for ebooks was affected, but for purposes of access to information. So this suggests, again, it's just merely descriptive, but this suggests that what the court is actually doing is balancing, on the one hand, market harm against other relevant factors, like access to information and promotion of competition. These seem to be the relevant factors in, at least in technology cases. Now, this raises 2 important questions, which we will not have time to address. The first one is this legitimate? Can the court engage in such an openly pragmatic reasoning, in such an openly pragmatic decision making? And the second relates to copyright reform. What does this case law teach us about the need to introduce fair use in European copyright law? I think we do need fair use, but maybe we need fair use for different reasons than the reasons that are usually invoked in scholarship. But I'm afraid that My 10 minutes are over or almost over, so I'm happy to discuss these questions outside. Thank you.